So this set of videos deals with the case on managing the Asian meltdown, the IMF in South Korea. And although this case happened in ancient times, right, 1997, it's such a perfect illustration of how these financial crises occur. It illustrates this. I mean, the Greek financial crisis more recently fit the same pattern. And really, that is the point, right? That the sorts of crises that occur, these balance of payments crises, tend to happen for the same reasons. There's a pattern. And you, as an international manager, based on this course, can learn that pattern and use that to develop an effective strategy to predict these kinds of things and develop a more effective strategy for your company. And when the International Monetary Fund provides financial assistance to the country and imposes conditions on the country's government in return for receiving that financial assistance, there also is a pattern. These conditions tend to be cookie cutter, right? They tend to follow the similar framework. Again and again, the same kinds of conditions are imposed in every case. And although the IMF has been heavily criticized for imposing the conditions in such a standardized way, that in itself is also useful. That pattern is also useful to you as a manager, because if you know what to expect, if you know what the conditions are likely to be, then you can develop a more effective strategy for your company. You can say, based on what we know is going to happen, we know that we can expect this, we can expect a recession, we can expect low sales in the coming months, and that can help you develop a more effective strategy for your company. So that's why it's so important to look at this. That's why this typical case, this perfect case that illustrates how these crises occur, how the IMF responds to these crises, is so useful. It's not meant to be a current events article. We'll have plenty of those in this course, as you know, but it's meant to really just to illustrate how these things happen and to help you understand these concepts and see the patterns, okay? So that's why we're talking about this case. Now, the questions to answer, right, that we'll be discussing as we go through this case are questions that should guide you as you read the case, as you watch the videos about the case. Why did this crisis occur in South Korea? And you see the reasons it happened in South Korea will be so similar for why these similar kinds of crises happen in Argentina, why the similar kind of crisis happened in Greece, right? So that's why this is a useful case to study. Is South Korea to blame, or was it the victim of external economic shocks? To what effect are there internal factors that we can monitor and measure and gauge to predict these kinds of crises? To what effect are these crises caused by external factors that we can also examine and predict, right? So all of this, understanding this, why this crisis happened in the case of South Korea, will help us understand future crises as well, right? So that's why this is useful. Now, the IMF's response to this crisis is the crucial thing for international managers to understand, because if you understand why, what the IMF is doing, why it imposes these conditions, what to anticipate, the fact that it does it in such a standardized cookie-cutter fashion is very useful to you, because then you can predict what's going to happen. And remember, the whole point of this course is to help you anticipate trends and developments in the global economy so you can develop a more effective strategy for your company. So that's why understanding the IMF's response to this crisis, which is so similar to the IMF's response to all the other crises that have happened and will be happening, is such an important thing to do. So that's why we're looking at that in some depth. And then what are the liberal, economic, nationalist, and structuralist, or as I put here, Marxist understanding of why these crises happen and the IMF's response? More important, I think, is really the IMF's response to the crisis, because then you can say, aha, based on my understanding, looking at it from an embedded liberal point of view, that's my understanding of how the IMF works. Well, now I can anticipate what the IMF is going to do next. Or if you think in some instances the IMF seems to be more motivated in this instance, perhaps by pressure from the capitalist countries, to, if you have that structuralist point of view, then that can also help you anticipate what is likely to happen. The other thing that's useful here is to understand why certain government officials may be responding the way they do, why certain other actors in that country's economy may be, adhering to the structuralist understanding of why the crisis happened or the economic nationalist understanding. So if you can understand where other people are coming from when trying to make sense of what's going on, then again, you can interpret their behavior. You can predict what they're likely to do. And that also is a very useful thing for an international manager to know. So that's why all of this is useful. Now, the IMF, as I have said, came under a lot of criticism from the economic nationalists, from the structuralists, but also in this instance, embedded liberals, very actually, free market economists, relatively conservative people that believe in the mission of the IMF. Martin Feldstein, a famous economics professor at Harvard, he passed away recently. Jeffrey Sachs, another famous professor, was for many years at Harvard, now at Columbia. They're also very critical of the IMF's approach to this. We'll also look at it from the extreme liberal view, the moral hazard view as well. So, and then finally, you need, as you go through this and think about this, what response do you believe would have been appropriate for the IMF and why? And what is your own understanding, right? So once we understand how this crisis happened, the IMF's response to this crisis in this instance, in this case, there'll be lessons we can take away from this that would apply to any future crisis. That's the purpose of these kinds of case studies. They're not meant to be current events articles. They're not meant to be what happened yesterday. They're meant to illustrate timeless principles, broad concepts that are applicable to any situation, even future scenarios. Okay, so that's what this case is about. That's why we're looking at it in some depth. And now we can proceed to discuss this case. What is the final outcome? Does it support or refute the approach the IMF took to this crisis? That's another issue we can talk about. And we'll talk about all of that as we go along.